Hi, it's Gary Forth from Tiger Hobbies Limited, and welcome to episode 3 of the Hawker Hurricane series. In episode 1 we covered the Hawker Hurricane from its origins up to and including the Battle of Britain. Episode 2 we looked at the Hawker Hurricane in combat, holding the line in the Middle East, Mediterranean and North Africa. In episode 3 we shall look at the Hawker Hurricane's, some of its toughest fighting, out above the jungles of Burma and the Far East. Once again, welcome to episode 3, the Hawker Hurricane. If you think the equipment situation was bad in the Middle East, in the backwaters of the Far East, it was much worse. For almost 2.5 years from the start of the war in Europe in September 1939 to the Japanese strike on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, other than the large naval fortress at Singapore, very little equipment could be spared from the main theatres of war in Europe and the Middle East. This resulted in lots of personnel, but not much way of modern equipment. In the late summer of 1941, with a threat of Japanese aggression in the area, Britain started to reinforce. But a lack of respect for the Japanese forces led to the British not taking the Japanese situation too seriously. They thought that the typical Japanese soldier was some short-sighted, buck-toothed individual. This was a terrible, terrible mistake. At a similar time of the Pearl Harbor strike, the Japanese hit Hong Kong, which fell on the 25th of December 1941, after a valiant last stand. The Dutch East Indies and French Indochina had already fallen. The biggest defeat was to be the British and Commonwealth forces in Malaya and Singapore. In January of 1942, the area being reinforced with naval units, lots of troops with little or no experience, and the arrival of 50 RAF Hurricanes to help the Brewster Buffalo, already defending the area. Senior British officers were completely outfoxed and outfought by a much smaller Japanese force of about 30,000, including many infantry on bicycles. Some British and Australian units fought valiantly, but many simply did not fight, or were not given the opportunity to fight by officers not prepared to commit. Reports later tried to blame the Australians for the loss of Singapore, but the Australians made up 15% of the Allied force, but took 75% of its battle casualties, which speaks volumes. The Allied Commonwealth Air Forces, RAF, RNZAF, possibly RAAF, flew very well with what they had, and shot down many Japanese aircraft. And the Hurricane proved itself as good as anything the Japanese had, but was totally outnumbered. What did not help was the lack of radar or other air warnings, which is amazing considering we were 2.5 years into the war. A total lack of communication between the Navy, Royal Navy and Royal Air Force resulted in the loss of 2 massive British naval ships, the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse, in the South China Sea. In the end, this whole disaster cost the British almost 10,000 casualties and 130,000 prisoners, including the ones lost and taken in Malaya, and about, 85 to 90,000 in Singapore alone, thus making it possibly the worst strategic defeat in British military history, and if not one of the greatest defeats in modern military history. In Burma, there were British interests in natural resources such as oil and rubber, and a much larger Japanese army of about 85,000, supported by Burmese insurgents, invaded Burma. The Allies' armies this time, consisting of British, Indian and Chinese, totalled over 150,000, would have to fight over a much larger area. But yet again, poor leadership and tactics let the Japanese run absolute riot, forcing the Allies back to the borders of China and India within a few months in one of the longest retreats in military history. Again, the person in charge of that retreat would be General William Bill Slim, who later on would command the 14th Army to great glory later on in the war. Again, the Royal Air Force with its Hurricanes and P-40s from the Chinese AVG, American Volunteer Group, Flying Tigers, tried to stem the growing Japanese tide. But for some reason, the air radar systems were removed back to India, resulting in the Royal Air Force and Allied forces flying blind and the Japanese bombers free to bomb at will any defending positions and retreating troops and civilians. With Singapore falling and Allied armies in retreat in Burma, the Japanese Navy turned its attention to the island of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, with its large British naval facilities at places like Trincomalee. Britain started to realise the terrible position in the Far East and Ceylon, with its commanding position guarding southern India and the control of the Indian Ocean. This was quickly reinforced using an older force of warships, including HMS Hermes, plus cruisers, destroyers, comprising the Far East Fleet. The Royal Air Force sent a further 2 squadrons of Hurricanes from the Middle East, including 30 Squadron. Churchill stated this was the most frightening day of the war, as the whole of the Far East was now in jeopardy, coupled with Rommel in full swing in North Africa. The British had now no choice but to stand and fight at whatever cost. They must not let the Japanese control the seas around Ceylon, and Winston Churchill made this absolutely clear. It is often stated the first 6 months of 1942 is when we came closest to losing the war, before the USA would be fully equipped and in full war production. The Japanese force heading to Ceylon was massive, including 3 fleet carriers, Akagi, Hiru and Suru. These would take part in the later Battle of Midway, and it had aircrew veterans of the attack on Pearl Harbor. On the 4th of April 1942, a Catalina flying boat flown by RCAF Squadron Leader Leonard Birchall spotted the Japanese fleet, and he managed to get a radio message out before being shot down by Zeros. In what now seems a complete slack attitude of British High Command in Ceylon, especially with the urgency of the situation, the Japanese gained complete and utter surprise on the morning of the 5th, just like Pearl Harbor. All the radars were switched off, even after warning received from the Catalina the day before. Hurricanes of 30 Squadron were on the ground when the Japanese bombers and fighters appeared, heading for the naval facilities. 30 Squadron got off the ground as quick as they could and engaged the enemy aircraft. In a air battle lasting just over an hour, the British lost 27 Fleet Air Ram and Royal Air Force aircraft, but 30 Squadron engaged the enemy, downing at least 14 enemy aircraft destroyed, 6 more probables and 5 more damaged. But this came at heavy cost, with only 8 or so of the 30 Squadron aircraft getting back and 5 of their pilots killed. One of the pilots engaged in this battle was Canadian pilot officer Jimmy Whelan, already an experienced pilot in Europe, with 3 kills against the Luftwaffe. Jimmy downed 3 Japanese bombers in quick succession in the attack, making him an ace, but was nearly shot down by Zeros before his fellow Hurricane pilots removed them. This showed the Hurricane, with a similar turn of speed as the Zero, not quite as tight a turning circle, could hold its own. The Hurricane's main advantage was its robustness compared to the Zero's flimsy construction, which for all its climb and turn rate could take very little punishment. In the end, the Battle of Ceylon was a defeat as far as ships lost. 1 carrier, 3 cruisers, 1 destroyer and a corvette, plus many sailors and ground personnel killed. But it proved we could stand and fight and take losses if needed be for the bigger picture. The Japanese, though, got a bloody nose as far as aircraft goes. They admitted to losing 5, but as many as maybe 70 were lost to Royal Air Force and Fleet Air Arm fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Somewhere in between, well, that may be the truth. But in the end, the Japanese did not get control of the sea, and those pilots will be missed in the coming battles of the Coral Sea and Midway. But lessons needed to be learned, especially if the British had been on full alert on Sunday, the 5th of April 1942. The Japanese may even got a bloodier nose, maybe some of their ships. But within a few months, Rommel had been stopped at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October-November 1942, and the danger of the Suez Canal removed, opening up the supply chain to the Far East, and at last the British could start building up its forces to take on the Japanese in Burma and further afield. Throughout the rest of 1942 and well into 1943, this period was used by the British and Commonwealth to build and train its forces. The RAF played an important role defending the borders of India to prevent the situation from becoming worse, and the Hurricanes, again along with American volunteer group P-40s, would have to hold the line, while the British built up a full air force from almost nothing. A new leader in the form of Admiral Louis Mountbatten formed SEAC, Southeast Asia Command, and at a similar time the 14th Army was formed under the general who led the retreat, General William Bill Slim, one of our most effective generals. The 14th Army would grow to the largest single army in the world, with over 1 million under its command. Many of them from India, 3 full divisions from Africa, and of course, British soldiers as well. On the aircraft side, many of the new types coming to theatre were Lend-Lease, such as more of the C-47 Dakota and the Vultee A-31 Vengeance, the RAF's only purpose-built design dive bomber, plus Vickers Wellington bombers and newer versions of the Hurricane, but still no Spitfires. The first Allied offensive in Burma was the Arakan on the coast near to India in late 42 and early 43. Although the Allies had greater numbers than the Japanese, the offensive failed. Slim stated, the Allied soldiers were simply not up to the task of fighting well-trained Japanese troops in the jungle. In early 1943, the Chindits, long-range penetration groups led by Maverick Commander Brigadier Ord Wingate, went on the offensive, in the first of a series of large-scale expeditions behind the enemy lines. Though not popular with many of the senior army figures, valuable lessons were learnt in these units by living and fighting in the jungle, and more importantly, not fearing the Japanese soldier. Plus the use of resupply by air and close cooperation with fighters and dive bombers. The Australians, some time before, had shown that the Japanese was no Superman during the battles in New Guinea. In late 1943, the first Spitfires would reach the theatre, but these would be an handful of Spitfire Mark V-Cs. So it was still up to the Hurricane, which carried on the burden as a prime Royal Air Force day fighter until at least March of 1944. During the development of the Spitfire, a new version was proposed, called the Mark VIII, but its gestation was too long, and as a short-term measure, the Spitfire was fitted with a Merlin 60 series engine, and it became the Spitfire Mark IX. The Royal Air Force was very happy with the Mark IX Spitfire, so when the Mark VIII was ready, the RAF had no real use for it. Many were sent to the United States Army Air Force, Royal Canadian Air Force units in the Middle East. But Southeast Asia Command and Australia were crying out for an up-to-date fighter. In early 1944, the first Spitfire Mark VIIIs arrived in India. With the new Spitfire taking over as the main day fighter, the Hurricane was still needed in the ground attack role, and this was redeployed as the Hurry Bomber, based on the new Mark II-C airframe, and would carry on this role in Burma till the very end of the war, supplemented by the new Royal Air Force P-47 Thunderbolts from Lend-Lease from late 1944. With growing strength, or Allied strength in India, the Japanese knew they had one more roll of the dice to take their fight into India. Operation You Go would be a win or lose it for the Japanese. On the British side, Slim knew the main force was still not ready to take on the Japanese in Burma, so the 14th Army units in the border area, especially around the towns of Imphal and Kohima, would have to hold out. Slim's orders were simple: no retreat, fight to the death if necessary, hold your ground. The Royal Air Force would resupply everything needed by air, including reinforcements. The Japanese would be made to pay for every inch of ground. The stage was set for what was to become the Stalingrad of the East, possibly the most bitter battle ever fought by the British Army in World War II. And in that summer of 1944, it again would be a piece of cast-off equipment that would prove valuable to the Army. The close support by Hurricanes and Vengeances, and on the ground, the Lee tank, replaced in service in Europe and the Middle East by the Sherman. This odd-looking tank with its side-mounted 75mm gun, turret-mounted 37mm gun, and various machine guns would prove better than anything the Japanese had, almost perfect for infantry support in taking out bunkers and beating back fanatical Japanese banzai attacks. Down on the left you'll see a couple Mirage 172nd scale M3 tanks. The top one is the Grant and the lower one is the US Army M3 Lee. Now, due to attrition in North Africa, most of the British Grant tanks were lost in North Africa. Some, though, did make it to theatre, but the majority of the M3 used by the 14th Army were Lee tanks directly from US Army stock. You can tell the Lee and the Grant. The Grant's got a slightly larger, flatter turret to enable a radio. Be put in the turret. The American radios were in the hull. The American Lee has got the standard Lee turret, and on top there's a small cupola with a .30 caliber machine gun. Fighting in the area around the two towns of Imphal and Kohima was bitter, and many times hand to hand, with the infamous Battle of the Tennis Courts in Kohima. So close was the fighting, literally the front line was a tennis court in the back garden of one of the old colonial houses. The 14th Army hung on for dear life, beat back attack after attack by fanatical Japanese, often with the help of Royal Air Force Hurry bombers and Vengeances providing close air support, and Dakotas providing resupply of food and ammunition. The Vengeance was one of the most ungainly looking aircraft ever to serve with the Royal Air Force in World War II. Its forward cranked wings, but it was a very effective dive bomber, capable of sticking bombs just in front of the defending British troops. The Royal Air Force tried to retire this aircraft as early as late 43, but time and time again, the 14th Army begged them not to do so. It was at Kohima that now Flight Lieutenant Whelan lost his life leading a flight of 34 Squadron Hurricanes. This incident was related by his wingman, Flight Sergeant Jack Morton. So let Jack Morton take the story. We were flying from Duragon when Jimmy was killed. He led 6 Hurricanes on attack on the rifle range, and I was his number 2. We bombed in sections of 2, and Jimmy and I were first in, bombing with 2 250-pound bombs with 11-second delays. I was slightly behind Jimmy when we dropped our bombs at about 50 feet, and as we left the target area, Jimmy's plane did a barrel roll and crashed. It was a very sad day, as Jimmy was the most popular of all the pilots, both in the officers' and sergeants' mess. We carried out 2 more attacks that day, and on both occasions we looked for his plane, but there was nothing to see in that dense jungle coverage. The battle for Imphal and Kohima was a turning point for the 14th Army against the Japanese, and the Japanese suffered from thick end of 80,000 casualties, though many were through simple starvation and total lack of logistics. The big push back into Burma could now begin, but it was the last great campaign of the Hurricane in large numbers. From late 1944, more of the Lend-Lease P-47 Thunderbolts replaced both the Vengeance and Hurricane, but Hurricane units remained in service in the Far East to the very last day of the war, and in fact the very last operational Royal Air Force Hurricane unit was 6th Squadron, with Mark II Cs in the Middle East, 1946-1947. Before I talk about the Hurricane you see on the turntable, I'm just going to cover a incident with the Royal Air Force Regiment in the defence of, I think it's called Mektila Airfield. Now, what happened? As the 14th Army knocked the Japanese for 6 at the end of the Battle of Kohima and Imphal, they started their offensive to move across Burma. So once they got out of the mountainous areas and Burma became more of a plain, they started using armoured columns to punch through. And some of these armoured columns were supported by units of the Royal Air Force Regiment, as they needed to capture airfields. And one of these airfields was Mektila. And the Japanese knew this, and knew that this airfield would be absolute strategic value as the Allies would be bringing in air support and reinforcements via this airfield. So the Japanese attacked and attacked day and night. And day and night the Royal Air Force Regiment held firm. In the mornings clearing up any remaining Japanese, and at night holding attacks. This unit was 1307 Wing Royal Air Force Regiment. It had armoured car, light anti-aircraft and field squadrons. And it was probably the most glorious episode in the history of the Royal Air Force Regiment. In a follow-up video, I will be doing a short history on specialist Royal Air Force ground units in World War II, including the Royal Air Force Regiment. I'll hopefully cover this battle and others in more detail. So at last, let's have a look at the Hawker Hurricane you see going around on the turntable. This is actually Hurricane PZ-865, the very last Hurricane to be built by Hawkers in late 1944, and not issued to the Royal Air Force, but retained by Hawkers for testing, used by Squadron Leader Peter Townsend in the King's Cup Air Race in 1950, used by Hawkers as a chase plane in the early Harrier project, and starred in the Battle of Britain movie in 1968. PZ-865 was then presented to the Royal Air Force now Battle of Britain Memorial Flight by now Hawker Siddeley in 1972. For many years it flew as JXC to represent Night Fighter Ace from one squadron, Flight Lieutenant Carl Cuttlewasher, DFC, but in 2010, after rebuilt, it was painted to represent Flight Lieutenant Whelan DFC, HW840 EGS 34 Squadron, Southeast Asia Command. You'll actually see just down on the left an earlier issue of the Orca Hurricane Mark II C by Hobbymaster, and this is actually JXE by that Polish pilot. Though the Hurricane may have changed its markings, it is its greatest credit of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight not to have donned their aircraft in the colours of the great aces of World War II and Royal Air Force personalities, but often in the markings of little-known squadron pilots who were the backbone of victory in World War II. The actual Hurricane HW840 would have been fitted with a tropical filter and bombs, but that's not the point of this model. Flight Lieutenant Whelan, DFC, a Canadian who gave his life in the Royal Air Force in World War II, there can be no better memorial than to have Hurricane PZ865 in his markings. It has been seen by millions of people over the years, wondering what's the story behind that little fighter with white stripes and little blue roundels soaring through the summer skies at air shows in Great Britain. This is the true memorial to the fighter that really stopped Great Britain losing the Second World War in those far-flung places overseas. Now, all the Hurricanes you see on the diecast ones on the display are unfortunately out of stock, but I'm looking to ask Hobbymaster to redo Flight Lieutenant Whelan's aircraft as an operational aircraft, and also some more SEAC stuff. I'd like to do a 17 Squadron Mark 8 flown by Squadron Leader Ginger Lacey. We did a Mark 14 earlier, but I think we could do a new Mark 8. All the plastic kits you see of the Hurricane are in stock, of course. And right in the centre, I've included a new kit, just come in. It's a mini art kit, it's 48012, and it's a 48 scale, highly detailed, advanced kit with full engine detail, wing detail, with all the weapon bays, of the Republican P-47 Thunderbolt Mark II from the Royal Air Force. And as you see, the markings are of the same as the Hurricane, so it's like green and earth with the light grey underneath. Just to your right, I mentioned before, there's a Spitfire MK VIII. That's the Royal Australian Air Force, who also got the Mark 8s at similar time to the Royal Air Force did, and really turned the tide in their battle against the Zeros out in the Pacific and the Solomons. So once again, thank you for watching this series of 3 videos about the Hawker Hurricane. Thank you once again.